welcome. I'm going to ask folks to turn your attention up here for just a second. I am Rachel Myers. I'm the Executive Director of the Washington Low-Income Housing Alliance. And I want to welcome all of you here in the room with me, our Housing Washington Conference participants, and online, our Conference on Ending Homelessness participants. So we are really excited to bring these two groups of folks who care about solving our affordable housing crisis together for this closing keynote for the Housing Washington Conference and opening keynote for the Conference on Ending Homelessness. Again, I'm Rachel Myers, the Executive Director of the Washington Low-Income Housing Alliance. If you don't know, the Housing Alliance changes public policy so that people in Washington of all races, ethnicities, abilities, genders, and identities can live in safe, healthy homes that they can afford. And we do this through educating decision makers, organizing, and amplifying the voices and priorities of people and communities most impacted by housing instability and homelessness. And we have a long partnership with the Housing Washington Conference, and we're so glad to be here today. And again, so glad for all of you who are online participating in the Conference on Ending Homelessness. Thank you. I also want to say thank you to the Washington State Housing Finance Commission for their generous support of the Conference on Ending Homelessness as a cornerstone sponsor. And we'll get to hear more from the commission when Bob comes up and closes us out at the end today. So now I am excited to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Jelani Cobb, a New Yorker staff writer, Columbia Journalism School dean, and prominent speaker on race, history, politics, and culture in America. Dr. Cobb has emerged as a clear voice in the fight for a better America. In the fight for racial justice, he stresses the importance of facing the past in order to forge a better future. A PBS Frontline correspondent for two critically acclaimed documentaries, Policing the Police and Whose Vote Counts, Dr. Cobb explores the enormous complexity of race and inequality while offering guidance and hope for the future. A longtime writer for The New Yorker and editor of its recent anthology collection, The Matter of Black Lives, Dr. Cobb's work is described as having the rigor and depth of a professional historian with the alertness of a reporter, the liberal passion of an engaged public intellectual, and the literary flair of a fine writer. What a description. New to Housing Washington, Dr. Cobb brings decades of experience to bear in his highly anticipated closing address. Please join me in welcoming Jelani Cobb.
Good afternoon. No, really? Seriously? I know that you all had a better gathering than that, so good afternoon. Good, thank you. So I want to first start off with a complaint, which is that, they did not tell me there would be barbecue here. So I'm booked to zip right back out to the airport because I have to get back for some commitments tomorrow morning. But I'm going to get some barbecue before I leave. Make sure that happens. Yeah. So I am happy to be here. Happy to be able to talk with you this afternoon. I think the work that you're doing, if you don't already know, I suspect you do, could not be more crucial, could not be more important at this moment. If we have any doubts about that, we need merely look around, look at what's going on around us, and see the tie-in or the ties in to housing in so many stories that either directly about housing or narratives that are just below the surface that connect to housing and housing policy. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk a little bit about that this afternoon. The kind of stories behind the stories as it relates to three major news events that I covered, and also weave in some history to make context of all of those things and the connections. So if you all saw any of the news, I came here from New York. I flew out this morning. If you all saw any news in the past week, you saw the deluge that hit New York City and the tremendous amounts of water that just gathered in various places throughout the city. I'm the dean of the journalism school at Columbia University. And, when I took that job, I was thinking one thing, about what deans do. Let me tell you, there's a whole other layer of things. Like when they came to me like the first month, and they were like, we're pulling up all the carpet and we're putting down new carpet. We want to know which carpet scheme you think we should go with. And I was like, I have a PhD in history. It wasn't the history of carpet either. I don't know. And so to my surprise, I am responsible for all sorts of other kinds of kind of organizational challenges and logistical challenges around the water that backs up into the building. And this is a New York City problem. It's not a Columbia University problem. Well, it's Columbia's problem. But the bigger issue is that New York City's aqueducts and waterways were not designed to handle the amount of water that's coming in these floods. And the notable thing about this storm was that this was supposed to be a run-of-the-mill rainstorm of the sort that we get all throughout the year. And then at the last minute, it accelerated and strengthened and became this major source of concern for the city. One of the notable dynamics, I just realized I was talking to a Columbia grad just a second ago, but if you have visited Manhattan, you know that there's a kind of paradox of Manhattan, which is that if you start at Wall Street, which is where I was yesterday, and travel uptown, the further uptown you go, literally the higher you get. If any of you have ever seen that film by Lin-Manuel Miranda, Lin-Manuel Miranda, in the Heights, he's referring to Washington Heights, which is the highest part in Manhattan, named after George Washington. In 1777, he chose to bunker his troops there in the course of the American Revolution, precisely because it was so high that you could look over and see if there's any movement among the British forces. And so that's why it's named to this day for George Washington and its literal height. Wall Street, by paradox, is barely, above the waterline. So if you go all the way downtown, and so some of the prime real estate is in the most low-lying area in Manhattan, and in some of the more recently affordable areas, they were paradoxically in the higher parts of Manhattan. Well, that is changing. If you've a careful eye, if you go to Lower Manhattan, you'll see that very many of the signature firms and the large brokerage houses and so on have moved. They have left the downtown area precisely because of this geographic layout. And we've also seen these are kind of not abstract questions. We've seen the tragic implications of them. Last January, in the midst of another significant rainstorm, we saw flooding throughout low-lying areas of Queens and Brooklyn. One of the implications of this was that people who had been priced out of housing in Manhattan and priced out of housing that was actually up to code had begun moving into the lower-lying areas of New York City into illegal rental units. Those rental units were generally many of them in the lower-lying areas of Brooklyn and Queens, and 11 people, in the course of that one storm, 11 New Yorkers drowned in their homes because they were in places where it was impossible for them to get out of the way of these increasingly powerful indicators of climate change. And so these are literally life and death issues, not simply in what we see at the forefront, tremendous storm, dumps rain on New York City, or all the kinds of tabloid headlines that we might see, but what the actual day-to-day implications are for people in their lives. I'd like to say this is the only time that we've seen something like this. It certainly is not. Not very long ago, we were in the midst of a lockdown. That interval that intruded into our lives out of nowhere in March 2020, a virus emerges that brings human activity across the globe grinding to a halt. For me, at that time, we were at home with my wife and I were at home with our 2-year-old daughter and our 4-month-old twins. Trust me, I want to drink something stronger than water. I'll tell you about that. My line about it was that it was miraculous that no one chewed off a limb to try to escape that apartment. And so, one of the things that we noticed, however, that was striking was COVID produced, and as a social scientist, that I am, I immediately started thinking about the data that this pandemic was going to produce. And COVID produced reams of data, even in its earliest days. Data about the impact of the climate, of our activity on the climate. Data on what happens if nobody drives in the downtown of your city. We've seen all sorts of climatological effects, social effects, educational effects. And so in the midst of this, we began obsessively following the data, the kind of micro data about what was happening in our community. And we lived in a zip code, 10025, that was adjacent to another zip code, 10027, which covered part of Columbia, the surrounding area of Columbia University, but also a significant part of Harlem. And then we started looking at zip codes that were squarely within Harlem. Now, an interesting dynamic developed. We lived in Columbia housing, faculty housing. The lockdown began in the midst of spring break. So many people were already gone. Many people were already outside, they'd already left. Those people came back, briefly gathered their belongings, and the students and undergrad and graduate students went home. The faculty in the building that we lived in disappeared. Very many of them had second homes, and so they decamped to their second homes. And in short order, the population density of the zip code that we lived in plummeted. And as we lived in this house this apartment, which was not quiet, to say the least, the clamor in our apartment was contrasted by the absolute silence of the building that we lived in. Correspondingly, we saw a strikingly low rate of transmission of COVID in our zip code. When we compare that to the zip code that was partly Columbia, partly Harlem, we saw a higher level of COVID transmission. And then when we looked at the zip codes that were squarely in Harlem, we saw an even higher level of transmission. So lots of things were happening here. And my wife and I talked about how we were essentially piggybacking on the financial privilege of our neighbors. Because we lived around people who had the resources to go elsewhere, we didn't have to go anywhere. And we were effectively benefiting from the wealth of our neighbors. For people who lived in the 27 zip code, for people who lived squarely in Harlem, no such options were available. Moreover, as we looked at the housing costs and the multi-generational households, and we came to recognize that COVID was most lethal for people who were older, and that more people, the people who were least compliant with the COVID protocols, were people who were younger. What did it mean that no young people in the city could afford to live on their own? It meant that they were living in multi-generational households, where they were likely to go out, socialize, interact with their friends, and then bring the virus home to parents and often grandparents who were more vulnerable. And so we see almost in the coding of what our financial structures look like and how they relate to housing and how we see what happens in people's day-to-day lives. It would be impressive, it would be one thing if this was new information, if we just learned these things. But more than a century ago, we had a housing reform movement that was geared at addressing these very concerns. In city after city after city, as people saw the swelling populations of the urban communities driven by the great migration of African Americans out of the South into industrial centers in the North and Midwest and the West, the ending portion of the great swell of immigration that came from Europe between 1880 and 1920, and the way that this doubled and tripled and quadrupled the populations of very many American cities, and people began to recognize the relationship between housing density and the quality of housing that people had access to and the transmission of tuberculosis. So this is not something that we just discovered. But as is the case, and as I recognize as a historian, we often learn things and then sometimes conveniently forget them when we realize what the implications of that knowledge really demand of us. In this case, we forgot that the simple idea of fair access to decent housing has all sorts of downstream benefits, has all sorts of downstream effects that really are salutary in this society. And we embarked upon a path that has led us to our present circumstance. So, in the work that I do with The New Yorker, I have written about very many things, but a preponderance of them have been incidents that relate to policing, about race and policing. And in that capacity, what I've learned and what I've observed in different communities around the country is that in writing about policing, I'm often writing about a metaphor for a whole array of other social concerns, housing and housing policy key to them, primary among them. And so, I'm going to walk through a few incidences in which this became increasingly apparent to me. In 2014, August of 2014, there was an encounter between a young man by the name of Michael Brown and a Ferguson Police Department officer, which culminated in the fatal shooting of Mr. Brown, who's 18 years old. Days of unrest and protests racked the city. The local gas station and mini-mart was burned to the ground in the midst of the immediate reaction to Michael Brown's death. Staggeringly, his body was left on the scathingly hot pavement in front of the community that knew him and loved him for 3 hours before he was finally removed. The New Yorker dispatched me there shortly after this happened. And I landed, got to the ground, and started talking to people. Now, as historians, I'm a historian and a journalist. When I was a young person, just as a kind of footnote, when I was a young person, I was an English major and effectively a double major in English and history. Part of me was interested in pursuing journalism, part of me was interested in pursuing history. When people, senior year, they would ask, which one are you gonna do? And I'd say yes. And so the work that I do, so you kind of understand where I'm coming from, the work that I do tends to be journalistic work that is deeply contextualized by history. And one of the complaints that historians often have is about the lack of historical knowledge that we have as a society. That very often, if you kind of go out on the streets and poll people about the key elements of our history, you'll come back with results that are not very impressive at all. And that's true if you do the kind of pop quiz version of this. But what I found in my work is that there is a kind of organic history that when you talk to people, they have access to the lineage of facts that have brought them to a particular moment in their community. And that happened with striking clarity in Ferguson. When I started talking with people, the first time that this happened was someone pointed out to me, they said, this happened and we're not all that far from where Dred Scott was buried. Dred Scott being the plaintiff in the 1857 case that determined whether or not black people had the right, if you brought an enslaved black person into a free territory, whether they would have the right to sue for their freedom. And that case famously was adjudicated by the Supreme Court and decided that because it was impossible for Negroes to be citizens of the United States, they in fact had no right to bring suit in the first place. And so this question about citizenship and belonging that was at the core of the incident that led to Mike Brown's death was connected in their minds to this history of 160, 170 years prior. And so we see that connection. More saliently, though, we began to talk about Shelley versus Kramer, the 1945 restrictive covenant suit brought by the NAACP that went to the Supreme Court and which brought to the foreground the nascent policies being used to segregate the booming or developing American housing market. And that happened in St. Louis, just 14 miles away from Ferguson. And then when we began talking about suburbanization and white flight, and how St. Louis was one of the first communities to begin with the racialized exit of its middle class into housing that was specifically designated and it was specifically exclusionary to people of color. And how all of those factors related to what happened on that single street in August of 2014. Ferguson, not coincidentally, was one of the first of these suburbs because it was so close to the city of St. Louis. By now, the suburbs of St. Louis were sprawling by 2014, where whites were much further out than they had been in the 1950s and 1960s when Ferguson began developing significantly. Right next to Ferguson was a mostly black community, suburban community called Country Club. And a kind of dark sense of humor, it was like, nobody names a place Country Club if you expect it to be all black. But this was an indicator of what had happened. And so in looking at the singular incident, the singular shooting, we could miss the entire forest surrounding us. And that forest surrounding us was the housing history that had all but led to, all but dictated that exchange. The following year, I was in Baltimore. There was a young man by the name of Freddie Gray. You may remember this case. He was arrested essentially for no reason by the Baltimore Police Department and not placed in the proper restraints, was put in the back of a police vehicle and given what they called a rough ride, where he would go bouncing around in various parts of this vehicle. He landed in such a way that broke his neck, killed him. In the course of this, when we looked at Freddie Gray's life, one of the things that came up was that his life had been marred by the impact of lead in the housing that he grew up in, and that he had been never able to achieve academically, never able to live up to his potential, likely as a consequence of the high lead levels that we saw there. When we looked back into the history of Baltimore, we saw similar dynamics to the ones that we'd seen in Ferguson with the suburbanization, the flight from Baltimore City out into Baltimore County. And then I came across something else, something that was little known to me, that Baltimore had been among the first cities to experiment with restrictive housing covenants. The very same sorts of dynamics. I see everyone has Richard Rothstein's book on the table. You know, Richard Rothstein talks a great deal about this and the significance of it. But the very same housing covenants that had been the source, really the initial focus of the NAACP in its pursuit of equality, beginning of the 20th century. What did we do? There's the entire landscape of inequality. What do we have to challenge first? Well, there are two things. We have to challenge lynching. We have to challenge housing segregation. That's what the NAACP goes after. And so Baltimore had been one of the first places to enact them. It had enacted them with such tremendous effect that it effectively became the test lab for other communities that wanted to pursue the same sorts of policies. There was another city that followed the Baltimore example in close detail. Strangely enough, because it's not a city that was dealing with very significant numbers of African Americans, was not a major depot for people arriving from the Great Migration, but nonetheless, Minneapolis becomes deeply invested in restrictive housing covenants. In 2020, I, like everyone else, watched with horror. Well, I would say I didn't watch. I did everything I could to avoid watching that nearly 9-minute video of George Floyd's life being extinguished. Finally, at the point at which I had to watch it as part of my professional responsibility if I was going to write and cover this issue, I sat down and watched about half of it. We know what happens. We know how the story ends. In the midst of this, we are looking at the virus that ravages populations across the country. We're seeing that the weight of the virus doesn't fall equally for the reasons I talked about at the outset. I have a kind of sardonic question that stays near the front of my mind. I'm asking, if this pathogen is so new that we literally refer to it as the novel coronavirus, how does it know the address of the hood? And I came up with an analogy. It's like we have these rain gutters that in most circumstances are not that visible. I mean, you can see them if you look, but they're fairly well cloaked. But in times of crisis, they become really apparent. And what rain gutters do is simply route water from the places that you don't want it to fall to the places where you're not that upset if it falls. And so we've seen hardship and turmoil routed through these channels and landing in places that become frighteningly predictable. In the case of George Floyd, Samuel Myers, a professor at the University of Minnesota, wrote an article about what he called the Minnesota paradox. And he said that Minnesota is perennially listed as one of the best places to live in the United States. I will tell you, I never agreed with that assessment, even before I knew any of the data. I visited Minnesota for the first time in my 20s. I was there to give a job talk. I didn't get the job, that was fine. But I landed and it was so cold, it was March, and it was so cold that I said, this weather is racist. So I feel personally oppressed by this temperature. Nevertheless, that notwithstanding, Minnesota is consistently cited as one of the best places to live in the United States for good reason. It boasts lower than average unemployment, boasts higher than average wages. There are very many reputable educational institutions there. The median SAT score for students in Minnesota is higher than it is for the national average median. And when you look at all of the indicators, housing remains fairly affordable. When you look at all of the indicators by which we judge the success of a community, or life outcomes, as we would call them, Minnesota fares pretty well, as long as you're not Black or Native American. When you look at the data for the indigenous population in Minnesota, when you look at the data for the African American population in Minnesota, you see a starkly different set of results. You see shorter than average life expectancy. You see lower likelihood of home ownership than you have in many other places. It boasts, or should we say, features, the state has the widest chasm between life opportunities for people who are classified as white and people who are classified as people of color. And all of this becomes apparent when you look at the surrounding community on South Chicago Avenue where George Floyd died. And so we see this again. The legacy of the restrictive housing policies, the issues of race and racism that dated all the way back to the Hubert Humphrey era of Minnesota politics, coming forward and seeing how they manifested the results in that 9-minute video, or creating the social prompts and the circumstances that make an interaction like that likely. Again, this isn't new. It's not new information. In 1968, the Kerner Commission report, which had been commissioned by President Lyndon B. Johnson to ask why there had been what they called civil disturbances, or what other people called riots, why there had been so many of them in 1965, 1966, 1967. And the 11 commission members take as their charge to get to the bottom of the unrest in American cities, and they come back and say this is a result of the failure of institutions. One of the primary institutions that they indict is housing. They come back to it, housing policy. This is an incredibly important commission that we should all be familiar with. We have to seriously understand the work of the Kerner Commission. Also, my documentary on the Kerner Commission airs this winter on American Experience. So, it's just, shameless plug here. But factually, it's true. There's a reason that we decided to do this documentary, because it's pointing to what we know and what we have found it convenient to not know. And so, in 2016, we see, there's one other thing I'll say before I kind of move away from the historical part of this. In 1968, we see the Civil Rights Act of 1968, Fair Housing Act, which directs all of the kind of remaining energy of the civil rights movement into this one area. And it results in all sorts of salutary effects, and even pops up in popular culture. I grew up in Queens, New York. I grew up in a place called South Jamaica. And there's another famous resident of Queens, New York, who has been in the headlines. You've probably heard of him. And he grew up in a part of Queens called Jamaica Estates. Jamaica Estates in South Jamaica have exactly the relationship you would suppose based upon their names. Jamaica Estates is at the top of the hill, wealthy, overwhelmingly, at least in my youth, overwhelmingly white. South Jamaica was working class, black and Latino at the bottom of the hill, kind of corresponding fortunes of these two communities. In the 1970s, some of you may remember a television show called All in the Family. You remember that? Yeah, okay. So there was a family that moved in, there was a family, the Archie Bunker, it was the Bunker family, who were the kind of central figures of this story. And then further into, a few seasons in, there's a family that moves in next door. Who remembers the name of the family that moved in? The Jeffersons, right. I figured, I have some pop culture people here. The notable thing about the Jeffersons is that they are African Americans. And there's a kind of comedy of the racial ineptitude of Archie Bunker, who has no concept, no frame of reference for African Americans. All of a sudden he has these black neighbors and he's constantly tripping over his own feet in interacting with them. I didn't know that Norman Lear was actually dramatizing the actual social developments in Queens, New York. Significantly, Queens, New York, at the time my parents moved there in 1965, was the second whitest borough of New York City. Queens is now, statistically, the most diverse county in the United States. 800 languages spoken there. And for me, I grew up taking what people later called multiculturalism or diversity for granted. Just we interacted with all sorts of people. I'll tell you this, if you permit me, I'll just give you a little anecdote that indicates this. Not long after 9/11, I was on a flight. I was flying from Atlanta to New York. This is a point at which flying was still really fraught for people. There's a lot of anxiety. I'm seated, I'm in an aisle seat and somewhere in the middle of the plane. And a gentleman gets on, tall, olive complexioned. He has taffia on and a white tunic, and white pants, and he kind of reads Muslim. And he's walking down the aisle, and you can almost see the tension ratcheting up as he gets closer and closer. He sits down across the aisle from me, one row back. And so I look at him, and then I look at him again, I say, "Excuse me, where are you from?" And he says, "Where are you from?" Appropriate response. I said, "I'm from Queens." He said, "Okay." And now the white people around us are all keyed in. They're all listening. The large black man is gonna save us. And I said, "I'm asking because I think you're from Queens too. And if you are who I think you are, we were in the same breakdance crew in high school." The white people around me all exhale. So he was a breakdancer, he's not gonna kill us. And he looked at me and said, "Jelani?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Shake?" I said, "Shake?" He said, "Yeah." We stood up, we hugged, everything is happening, people are just relieved. But it was important because people saw, especially in that moment, it was easy for people to see the worst version of our fears. What I saw as a product of the community that I grew up in was someone who I'd spent formative hours of my youth with, someone whose home I had visited, someone whose table I had eaten at. And so that speaks to the version of this community that I grew up in. Not everyone saw it that way. And there was a kind of allergic response to the dynamics of diversification that led to people kind of withdrawing, sometimes literally, sometimes psychologically and culturally. And that's what was at play in that television show, the Jeffersons, Archie Bunker, and so on. In 2016, this explodes into the public consciousness. And there's a very ugly political mood that develops. Xenophobic, misogynistic, racist. It's very easy to gauge what we saw happening based upon the truculence of the most visible components of these movements. But also it's more complicated, because when we looked at populist movements in the United States, we kind of go back through most certainly right-wing populist movements, there's typically a very prominent thread of nativism, xenophobia, very often a very prominent thread of racism, commonly a prominent thread of anti-Semitism. When we think about what we saw in Charlottesville, that's also obvious. And then if you sift through all of that, you often find a fairly valid economic critique. It's just a valid economic critique that gets siphoned off into the worst instincts of human beings. And so at the very moment where we begin to have a public consciousness around these things, where we begin to raise the questions of what exactly has happened to the possibility of there being a stable middle class. And this is something that we can point to in housing, it's something we can point to in education, where we have seen the cost of education increase at 2.5 times the rate of inflation. It's something that we can talk about in healthcare. I spoke to a group of healthcare providers about 3 or 4 months ago, and I said, you all were shocked that nobody believed you when you said that people should take the vaccine. I said, why should they believe you? Because most people's interaction with our healthcare system is as a institution that will leave you broke and bankrupt, and that will increasingly try aggressive measures to wring every penny out of you that they can, holding your health hostage. I wouldn't believe an institution like that either. And so when we see all of these kinds of dynamics. One of the things that is useful about the historical lens is that we can understand the crises that I've laid out here. We can also understand what people have done in the face of those crises. I mentioned at the outset the tenement reform movements of the early 20th century and the yield that they created in changing the landscape of American housing. The 1968 Fair Housing Act and the impact that it has on possibilities in American life. When we look back, the victories that we have attained have come under circumstances that were far more formidable, far more daunting, and far more difficult than those that we encounter at this moment. For all the negative implications of climate change and the pandemic, we have stripped away the facade of inequality. We have stripped away the facade of equality, and we are staring directly at the implications of inequality in our society. We have never had more access to the resources to address these questions. We have a developing and growing social conscience around the implications of these questions. We have a growing body of scholarship that supports our work. The most key thing that we need at this moment is the belief that we can actually win. And so at the end of this, what I'll say to you is this. For all the people that we hold up as heroes, for all the individuals we laud, for the movements we praise, for the great historical precedents that we cite in our textbooks during our various Black History Month, Women's History Month, all of the points, every element that we celebrate or recognize. We honor them for what they did in moments of adversity. We know almost nothing about what any of these individuals did in their time of relaxation or in moments of great ease. And so we look to them for inspiration. We recognize that difficulty brings about the growth of character that allows us to move on to victory. And we steel ourselves to yet again place our shoulder against the wheel of history and push. Thank you.